Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're digging into the preliminary investigation report of Air India flight AI171. And guys, this one has blown the aviation world wide open with a chilling new mystery. We're talking about a perfectly routine morning that turned catastrophic in just 3 seconds. Who cuts off the fuel to both engines right at liftoff? Let's get right into it.
Picture this for a second. The plane is climbing, the engines are absolutely roaring, and then, out of nowhere, the lifeblood of the aircraft is completely severed. On the cockpit voice recorder, right as the engines start choking, you hear this terrifying exchange. One pilot desperately asks, "Why did you cut the fuel switch?" And the immediate frantic response, "I didn't do it." We still don't know exactly who asked the question and who answered, but this bone-chilling moment right after liftoff is the absolute core of our analysis today.
Now, you might be wondering, could this just be rookie error? Absolutely not. Let's look at who was actually flying the plane. In the left seat, we had 56-year-old Captain Sumit Sabharwal. This guy had a massive 15,600 total flight hours under his belt. And get this, over 8,200 of those hours were strictly on this exact aircraft type, the Boeing 787. We're dealing with an incredibly experienced commander here. And right beside him was First Officer Clive Kundur. At 32 years old, he had 3,400 total flight hours, with over 1,000 on the 787 Dreamliner. Plus, the preliminary report makes it crystal clear. Both pilots completely passed their pre-flight breathalyzer tests about an hour and a half before departure. Perfectly normal, perfectly fit to fly for what was supposed to be a completely standard morning trip from Ahmedabad to London. Even the aircraft itself, registered as VTNB, was totally by the book. It had flown in from Delhi earlier that morning, had a minor technical hiccup that maintenance completely resolved, and it was good to go. The takeoff weight was 213,400 kilograms, which included 54,200 kilograms of perfectly clean fuel, flawlessly within the normal operating limits. No dangerous cargo, literally nothing out of the ordinary at all.
And the weather? Mother Nature was fully cooperating for the 230 passengers on board. When they asked for pushback at 1:33 p.m., wind speed was a super gentle 6 knots. Visibility was a fantastic 6,000 meters. Skies were completely clear. It was basically textbook perfect flying weather.
So, First Officer Kundur is at the controls for takeoff, and the timeline rolling down runway 23 is completely flawless. At 1:38 and 33 seconds p.m., they hit V1, which is 153 knots. That's the absolute point of no return. 2 seconds later, they hit VR, rotation speed, and precisely at 1:38 and 39 seconds, this massive Dreamliner lifts off the runway. If you look at the CCTV footage, it shows a beautiful, absolutely normal departure.
But here is the exact moment everything falls apart, literally 3 seconds after liftoff. The plane is at 180 knots. The enhanced flight data recorders show us that at this precise critical fraction of a second, both engines are doing exactly what they should be doing, producing the massive thrust you need to climb. And then, the data reveals a highly shocking sequence. The fuel switch for engine 1 abruptly moves from the run position to the cut-off position, right? And then, exactly 1 second later, the switch for engine 2 does the exact same thing. Bam, bam. Both primary fuel supply lines are severed. And without fuel, the N1 and N2 rotational values of those engines just instantly plummet. The engines are starving.
The fallout from this was instantaneous. Airport security cameras actually caught the ram air turbine, or the RAT, deploying right after liftoff. Now, the RAT is basically a small emergency propeller that drops out of the belly of the plane only when the main engines fail, just to keep the absolutely crucial electrical systems alive. Seeing that pop out just seconds into a flight, that is the universal sign of a massive, terrifying loss of power. And sure enough, the plane starts rapidly losing altitude. What happens next is just a complete tragedy. At 1:39 and 5 seconds p.m., air traffic control picks up a frantic Mayday call. The controllers could only watch helplessly as the aircraft crashed right outside the airport boundary. It clipped an Army Medical Corps chimney about 1,600 meters away and then made its final devastating impact at a medical college hostel. The debris field stretched 1,000 feet long. This horrific crash claimed the lives of all 12 crew members, 229 passengers, and 19 innocent people on the ground. Unbelievably, one single passenger survived purely by luck, sitting next to an emergency exit that popped open.
Okay, so let's put on our detective hats here and look at what investigators pulled from this wreckage. The flap handle? Sitting perfectly at 5 degrees. The landing gear lever was still down. The thrust levers, even though they were badly burned, were locked in the forward position. Every single one of these matches a normal takeoff configuration perfectly. The crew didn't panic and start wildly scrambling the core flight controls.
But you guys, here is the absolute most baffling detail in this entire preliminary report. If the fuel was cut right after liftoff, completely starving those engines, why in the world were the physical fuel control switches found turned back on to the run position in the wreckage? Think about that. Sometime between that catastrophic shutoff and hitting the ground, the pilots actively reached down and turned the fuel back on. To really get why this is so weird, you have to understand how these switches are built. You can't just accidentally bump them with your coffee cup or your elbow. They feature this complex, fail-safe locking mechanism specifically made to stop accidental shutoffs. You practically need two hands to operate one. You've got to actively push the lock-in with one hand and then pull the switch up or down with the other. Accidentally cutting off one switch, basically physically impossible. Accidentally cutting off two, exactly 1 second apart, that completely defies physical logic. And the black box data lines up perfectly with what they found in the wreckage. The flight data shows Engine 1 was starved of fuel for about 10 seconds and Engine 2 for about 14 seconds before they were flipped back on. The data proves the engines actually started receiving fuel again. They started spooling back up, trying to produce thrust right before impact. The crew was actively trying to save the plane. They just ran out of sky.
So investigators are staring down a massive contradiction here. And it essentially leaves us with two major theories to explain this absolutely bizarre anomaly. Either we are looking at an unprecedented, catastrophic mechanical malfunction of those switches, or a deliberate, intentional act of pilot suicide. Let's look at both of these objectively, strictly based on the facts we have.
When we look back at the history of intentional pilot actions, think of flights like Germanwings 9525 or Egypt Air 990. Investigators always find very consistent, chilling patterns. In almost every single historical case like this, there is total radio silence, no calls to ATC, and the aircraft is almost always deliberately forced into a steep, unrecoverable nosedive straight toward the ground.
But here's the thing. AI171 contradicts pretty much every historical pattern of a suicide mission. Like we just saw, the pilots actively fought to turn those switches back to the run position. They weren't silent. They broadcasted a Mayday signal just 2 seconds before the crash. And even more telling, the flight data shows the plane's nose was pitched up. The elevators were kept in the takeoff position. They were actively trying to climb. These are clearly the actions of a crew fighting for their lives, praying those engines would catch in time.
So if we know the crew was fighting to save the aircraft, that points us right back to the mechanical malfunction theory. But to understand that, we have to rewind the clock a bit. We need to look back 7 years before this crash, all the way to 2018.
Back in 2018, the FAA actually issued a special airworthiness information bulletin. It warned of a very specific risk. The fuel control switch locking feature could potentially disengage. Now, this was originally flagged for 737 models, but this specific part number 4TL8373D, is identical across a bunch of Boeing models. And crucially, this exact part was sitting in our Air India 787. Air India had actually skipped an advisory inspection for it because, well, under the FAA rules, it was just a recommendation, not a strict mandate.
But come on, even the mechanical theory has a glaring hole in it. Let's say the locking mechanism was completely faulty. What are the astronomical odds that both totally independent switches would critically fail entirely on their own exactly 1 second apart at the absolute most critical fraction of a second during takeoff? That deliberate 1 second rhythm? It looks so suspiciously like human intervention. It really tangles up the pure malfunction theory.
And that brings us to the terrifying paradox of flight AI171. If the flight data clearly shows the pilots fought to the bitter end to save the plane, and if we know those switch locks are mechanically designed to never, ever fail by a simple accidental bump, then who or what deliberately cut the fuel to both engines exactly 1 second apart? The preliminary report leaves us staring into this haunting void. I want you to look at the data we laid out today, weigh the evidence, and tell me what you think happened up there. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. And remember, never stop questioning the facts.